All right, everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to discuss the 5 things to look out for while buying a classic Ford Mustang. Now, I actually have probably one of the worst examples of basically this is what you don't buy unless you really know what you're really getting into. So I have a great example of what is actually out there in terms of worst condition. So a perfect example behind me, if you've been following along with the channel, of me taking this car down to basically a bare shell at this point and trying to restore it back to its former glory. But we're gonna look at the 5 most important things to look out for while buying one of these cars today. So let's get started. Oh dear. All right, my door is broken. All right, now that I've gotten inside the Mustang without actually struggling to open my door, amongst the other things that are wrong with the car, first thing to look at, rust. This car is a perfect example of what a Mustang could be like when you're inspecting it upon purchasing one of these things. They love to rust. That's why they're nicknamed the Rustang. So one of the most prone areas for these cars is the firewall. So as you can see right here, the firewall is absolutely destroyed right there on the driver's side. So if I pan over here, same thing on the passenger side footwell. So they love to rust on the firewall there as well as in your footwells. So they love rusting right in the floor pans where you can actually see part of my frame rail right there. There you guys go. And then there's the firewall. So one in the passenger footwell on the driver's side, that thing is absolutely toast. I almost fell through that a few times while I was sitting in the back of the car, where I basically had my foot nearly go through it. So that gives an idea what these cars can rust out to being inside the cab. All right, next areas on these cars where you really got to look out for on the rust is right down in the quarters right here. So these things completely rust out, where you can see that right there basically got a hole, but it's also because it got crunched. But these are really known for rotting out. Same thing all up in the arch of the actual wheelhouse. And then obviously there's your perfect example of the wheelhouse where the rocker meets the quarter. Complete hole right there, right through. You can see inside the vehicle at that point. All right, now moving on to the trunk here. For the rust, you can see basically there's nothing left of the extension panel that meets the quarter from the trunk pan. So there's that. That's a really bad prone rust area, minus the fact that this car got hit really hard. And that's basically a goner. It's not even attached anymore, to be completely honest. Same on this side. You can see the holes right down through there. That's the basic rust areas where you got to really look for on this car, on these cars, before buying one, and understand how much metal you're going to be into one of these, because they can be pretty rusty in a lot of prone areas that could be covered up or hidden by other body work or shady kind of metal work that was done in the past. So you have to be very cautious when looking at one, because they got a lot of different things going on. Here's another section of the Mustang where you got to look at for rust. There's the front frame rail on the passenger side. That right there, the best way to describe it, that is a crusty, crunchy Tostito chip of metal. It's just flaking apart. So that's another section of the car you're going to want to look at, is the front rails, which lead up to the firewall. That is a piece of the firewall that's actually coming down through there. That's from the inside of the car that you're actually looking at right there. That's on the bottom, since we're looking at the bottom of the vehicle right now. Here's another shot of your wheel arch on the passenger side. You can see how rotted out it is and deformed from when it got hit. But this is a very, very prone area to be for rust, especially on the cars that are in this, on the rust belts up back east. These cars are very much prone to basically have nothing left back here. I'm fortunate enough that this is a California car. Frame damage, right there. Buckled right at the bump stop. Very prone spot for these cars when they get hit in the back of the car. On both sides for this one too. So on the other side, you can see a slight crack right over there. It's kind of hard to see, but that's where they like to crack. Right at the bump stops. And that's not all. When these cars get hit hard enough, there's the inner wheelhouse. You can see a clear crack right there, which in turn, this whole section of the transition pan that goes from the floor to the trunk is buckled because how hard it got hit. So the whole back of this car is shifted this way and up because of the hard hit it had. And not only that, there's inner roof structure damage. And like I showed earlier, here's your rear frame rail that goes to the trunk tail section panel. That is broke clean through on the trunk pan to the tail panel section where the frame rail is. This side's basically rotted out, but it's also crunched. Better idea how bad the car's twisted. You can see it because I'm holding the camera basically level, but you can see the left-hand side is up than what the right side is at. You can totally see it. That side's up, that side's down. Another view from the bottom side of the rear frame rail on the driver's side. You can see it's got a clean crack right through it, on top of the fact that it's got tons of rust that we've already discussed about. Perfect example of a broken, rotted out shock tower, right there. This car got hit so hard in the rear, it went up obviously onto a curb or something, and it cracked the shock tower. So speaking of frame damage, this is a perfect example of what to look out for, because this is worst case scenario, but generally speaking, they have what would be a hairline crack, and it'd be somewhat noticeable, but not really to the person that would be new to the hobby and not really looking out for it. So I'll show you an example, because this car has what I'm explaining on the other shock tower. So let's get to it. Perfect example of what I'm trying to explain compared to the other side, which obviously that's really, really bad because it has an outside influence cracking the shock tower. But they usually start out cracking like this, and then it can get much worse, and then you're in the boat of having to replace this whole shock tower or shave it and do a coilover system instead. But to anyone who's just now getting into the hobby, make sure to check for this, because this is something that you'll easily miss if you're not really trained to look for it. Which in the end, you take it home, you look through the car, pull the engine out, and then you see it and you're like, well, this sucks. I'm gonna be doing a shock tower, I guess. So definitely take a look at your shock towers on any Ford Mustang from the 60s and 70s, 100%, because that is a prone weak spot on the cars. All right, so we've discussed two different parts of the 5 subjects today. Number 1, these cars are prone to rusting, and they are absolutely horribly known for it. Number 2, frame damage. At one time in their life, I'm sure the car got hit and there might be frame damage, so definitely take a look at your frame damage. Now, don't be like me and buy the car that has both of those problems. That's what not to do. So don't follow my lead and try to find a car that either has one or the other or none. So, number 3, make sure you check the VIN numbers of the car. These cars have been passed around like the village bicycle. So, I love that phrase, because like this particular car, I had a problem getting a title for it. All the VIN numbers match on the car. There's the 3 main places that I had used to be able to attain a title, which is on the shock tower. There is a spot on the fender, underneath the fender actually, where the VIN number is engraved and stamped into. The second place is obviously where the dash plate is. Number 3 is the door. All 3 of those match. I was able to get the title for the car. But this car was hard to get the title for, so that's a whole nother story though. But always make sure the VIN numbers match on the car, because these cars have been cut apart, pieced back together with other parts cars, because back in the day, they didn't have Dynacorn to go buy parts for them. They would go to a junkyard and cut sections of cars apart and then replace those sections on their car. So make sure that the VIN numbers match, especially if you're buying a car on a bill of sale only, or you're doing a state title transfer, to make sure that the VIN numbers all look good. You don't want to buy a car that's had finagling of the VIN numbers. Absolutely a big no-no. I do not believe in body swapping. That is an absolute big no-no in this industry. So make sure your numbers match. Make sure the title's good, or the bill of sale. You know, obviously you're taking a risk with that. And then always make sure you check the VIN numbers on the car. Make sure they all match. All right, continuing on here. Number 4, the completeness of the interior and exterior trim. Now, when looking one of these cars over, you gotta make sure that you look over the entire vehicle and do it thoroughly to make sure what is missing or what is damaged, and what is gonna be really needed to be fully restored in terms of all the different trim for the windshield, to the bumpers, to the interior trim. All those things play a factor in the cost and when doing one of these restorations. So how complete the car is really plays a factor. Plus understanding and knowing that these cars have been taken apart probably more than a few times in their life, and people tend not to put things back the way they should, and they'll usually use like self-tapping screws, wood screws, rivets, really weird, strange things that they use to put them back together, and that generally ruins the part. So luckily for us though, these cars you could build practically right out of the catalog, which is absolutely fantastic for the classic Ford Mustang enthusiast. You can go online and get anything you practically want for one of these cars. And if you can't find it in a catalog, you could find one easily online, a used one right out of a junkyard, or somebody selling a parts car. So luckily that these cars have a plentiful amount of parts still available. That way we can restore these cars easily without much frustration. So definitely always make sure to check the completeness, because it comes down to the fine details in the end to making sure we get the car completed correctly. Alright, on to the fifth and final subject here of what to really look for in terms of buying one of these classic Ford Mustangs. Onto the engine and drivetrain components. Now, not every car is going to have an engine in it. It might just be a roller with a rear end in the car. Sometimes you don't have anything and it's not even a roller and you got to drag it onto the trailer. But when you buy an older restoration and you're going to use it as a driver, always make sure and double check the engine compartment with the electrical to start with. I mean, people and their bright ideas and how they like to rewire things absolutely astounds me sometimes. Example A. This car had some real hokey-madokey stuff going on, wired together by some clowns that thought certain things would just work out. But in reality here, I'm shocked the car didn't catch on fire. So, moving on. Always check your electrical. Next is if you have an older vehicle, you know, the Mustang that's been restored 20, 30 years ago, and you plan on driving it and just enjoying the car. Now, the engine, always double check it. You can do a leak down test, do a compression test. I mean, the seller shouldn't have any problem with doing that. I mean, if they're being honest and truthful with the sale of the car, they should be honestly okay with you doing a compression test or a leak down. Now, they might not let you personally do it because they don't want you touching the car, but you can obviously say, hey, we can take it to a shop that's in the area. Let's do a test on it. Because if you plan on driving the car, you don't want to buy a drivable restoration and the engine could be completely bad, because it could be a 30-year-old engine that's got 100,000 miles on it. It could be smoking, it could have low oil pressure, it'd just be tired. And you would spend money on a car that looks okay, but mechanically it could be tired. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you could buy a car that has an engine in it, but it hasn't ran in 20 years, or 30 years, or 40 years. And with that scenario, you always want to make sure the engine's free, it's not locked up where the car has been stored. Look at the factors of all that. And to look into something like that would be to bring a 1/2-inch breaker bar with a socket and see if the engine spins. If it doesn't spin, well, I mean, you could take a risk and put some ATF down into the cylinder bores and see if that'll free it up a little bit. And if that don't work, you got yourself a 600-pound boat anchor. And then you'll be looking to buy an engine, or if you take it apart, if it will even come apart, and then hopefully nothing is damaged in doing so. Now, this particular engine, this 302, is not original to this 69 Mustang. The VIN does not match. So if you want to see if the VIN matches, there is an engraving of the last bit of the VIN number on the back of the block right here. And this VIN doesn't match this car. So example A, this engine is not an original engine to the car, but it is a date code 1968 302, and it was built in December. So it is an original era engine to that year, but not the original one to the exact car. Now, it doesn't really matter. This is just a 302 two-barrel car, sports roof. No big deal. It's not some high-end Mach 1 with a 351 Cleveland or a Windsor or even a Boss 302. And with those kinds of cars, you really got to make sure what you're looking at buying and double check all your numbers and make sure it's actually the real deal, because a lot of these cars were obviously abused and put away wet, and they absolutely destroyed them. So these engines usually were not the original ones in the cars when you find them. Yes, there's a lot out there that are original, but you have that risk that, you know, the car, how it was driven and how it was treated, the engine might not be original. And then if you have a high dollar value vehicle that you're trying to restore, it might bring the value down quite a bit. might not bring down the value at all as long as you put a date code original era engine back into it. So a lot of different factors. So always make sure to check your engine compartment for the electrical, check the engine, make sure it doesn't make any weird noises, check the oil pressure. If it doesn't have an oil pressure gauge, see if you can bring one and hook it up, check the oil pressure. Involving the transmission, make sure the transmission obviously isn't slipping or anything along the lines of leaking. I mean, they all leak practically. I mean, this one leaked like a sieve. So, but always check the driveline out, make sure everything looks okay, no cracks or anything like that on any of the mounts. Like the cross member on this car, luckily enough, wasn't cracked from the impact, or nothing was shifted to the point of where the drive line pushed itself up into the backside of the tail housing of the transmission and cracked the tail housing of the tranny. So that's a whole nother scenario though. So not every car is like that. So definitely check into the engine compartment. But that's gonna wrap it up here for the 5 things to really check for. Those are some real straightforward, basic recommendations. Now, there's a lot more to look at into these cars besides all that, but those are the real main focus points to look at in one of these cars when buying it, because trust me, you don't want to buy a car, you're all excited for it, you take it home and it turns out to be an absolute piece of crap. So, you invested your time and your money, and you want to have a nice enjoyable project or a nice driver, to drive on the weekends. And not every restoration is absolutely honest. And that's a really good word to use, is honest, because these cars, some restorations are absolutely shoddy and you could buy a complete jalopy. So always double check and make sure everything on the car is there to do the restoration, or if it's a driver, make sure everything's functioning properly, and that way you don't have any issues that are going to be huge fat headaches later down the road. So I hope everyone has enjoyed my episode today. So stay tuned for more episodes on Fast Times Garage. Thank you for watching.